These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? What checks can white give with his queen? Only queen moves to g4. Having seen this, dig for some way to attack a loose black piece at the same time. The cluster of pieces at c8, d7, and e7 looks promising, but as yet contains no suitable targets, so ask what the effects of an exchange would be. Look in particular for any trouble you can start that will leave a black piece loose at the end of it. 1 rook takes rook, queen takes rook leaves the c8 rook unprotected, and thus makes it a good target that white can reach from g4. 2 queen moves to g4, check. Wins the rook after black moves his king. White to move. What is the best move? And now a last related idea. We have seen that a first principle of tactical play is the importance of inspecting checks you can give and your opponent's responses. A second and related principle is the importance of experimenting with any mating threats you can create, most typically by directing a second piece at a square next to the enemy king that you already attack once. Here is a simple example. White's queen hovers near the black king. The situation is tense because white's knight is pinned, but white does have one obvious offensive possibility. Pawn from h5 moves to h6, where his pawn then is positioned to provide cover for queen moves to g7, checkmate. Next move, it follows the formula, the pawn adds an attack against a square already attacked once by white's queen. Black can't allow this. And since he is unable to move his king, he has no choice but to take out the pawn with knight takes at h6. White asks what would then be possible. Returning to first principles, he looks for any checks he would be able to give and any forks he might inflict in the process. This leads to queen moves to f6, check. Winning the loose knight. Soon we will look more closely at uses of mating threats to create queen forks, but the basic principle is clear enough. A mate threat that doesn't at all work to create mate may work wonderfully in other ways, viz., to create a loose piece. In this case the point of the mate threat created with pawn from h5 moves to h6 had nothing to do with actually achieving mate. The point was to force black to rearrange his pieces in a way that would lead to new tactical shots. Try thinking about mate threats in this way, as a means to an end other than mate. Black to move. What is the best move? Moving the enemy king into position. Now consider a scenario opposite to the one we have been studying. You see a loose enemy piece you can attack, but not the other ingredient of a classic queen fork, a check you can give at the same time. You need to make the king move someplace where it can be attacked simultaneously with the loose piece. The most natural way to do this is with a preliminary check from a different piece or perhaps from the queen itself. The check forces the king to move, and once it reaches its new square a fork may follow. Another way to move the king is by initiating an exchange, rather than a check, that draws the king onto a square where it can then be attacked or pushed around some more. The practical point: if you need to move the king, ask what checks you have and what the king protects that you might be able to capture. If the answers to those questions help move the king but not far enough, then ask them again. In this first example to the left, white's rook is loose. That is a starting point for analysis because it gives you a target to focus on. Ideally, black would like a move that attacks the rook and gives check at the same time. Presently it can't be done, so look for any checks that might force the white king into a position where it could be attacked along with the rook. It turns out that black has just one such check to examine. Rook moves to d1. White is required to answer with king moves to h2. Now reassess the resulting board, again asking whether black can attack the king and the loose rook at the same time. This time you find queen moves to b8, check. Winning the rook. The other route to the solution is to look first at rook moves to d1. When your rook has a clear path to the enemy king's rank, it's natural to consider moving it there and to ask what the reply would be. Here you see that white's king escapes to h2. The crucial thing is to keep pressing then, asking what your next checks might be and whether any of them can be turned into forks. This position is a nice study either way you look at it because the idea of a fork does not particularly suggest itself at the outset. It is not a case where there are visual clues indicating that the fate of white's king and rook are linked. Producing a crushing, game-winning fork in 2 moves thus might seem magical to the uninitiated. But the magic is the residue of method. White to move. What is the best move? Black's rook is loose, but there is no way for white's queen to attack it and give check at the same time. So look at the checks white can give and consider their consequences. There are 5 such possibilities: queen moves to a8, queen moves to e8, queen moves to h7, queen moves to h4, and queen moves to h1. A couple of them, queen moves to a8 and queen moves to h7, can be dismissed without any real thought. But then there are the others. A. Queen moves to e8, check. Forces the king to h7, this almost works because it then allows queen moves to e7, check. Attacking king and rook. But of course black replies rook takes queen. B. Queen moves to h4, check. Forces king moves to g8 but leaves white with no good follow-up. From h4 there is no way to attack king and rook simultaneously. C. Queen moves to h1, check. Also forces king moves to g8. But this time white does then have a move that attacks king and rook at the same time. Queen moves to g1, check. Winning the rook. White to move. What is the best move? Black's bishop is loose, so white's energies turn to ways it might be attacked while also giving check. It can't be done from the current position on the board. White's only check with the queen. 1. Queen moves to c8, doesn't attack the bishop. But it does push the king to h7, and then might a double attack be possible? Keep your eye on the loose bishop, which you are working to capture, and examine every check that would be available after the king moves, looking for a double attack. 2. Queen moves to f5, check. Wins the bishop. Notice the importance of not rushing off to examine checks with other pieces, such as white's knight, in order to help arrange a queen fork. Sometimes the queen can do all the work by itself, as it does here. With black's queen poised to give check, white wouldn't want to go forward with the sequence without making sure his own king will be safe at the end of it. The fork will cause white's queen to be taken far away from its king and leave it out of position to supply defense. But white would have a decent reply to black's queen moves to g1, queen moves to e1, or queen moves to c1, so the coast is clear for the fork. White to move. What is the best move? Our drill used to be looking for checks. Now it's looking for loose pieces. In practice you want to do both, of course. Here black's bishop is loose, so look for some way to attack it and give check. The queen can't attack the bishop with any of its available checks. Queen moves to f8, queen moves to h8, queen moves to e3, and queen takes at g6. But examine the consequences of those moves and you find that queen moves to h8, check. Forces king moves to g5. Remember the goal, to attack the loose bishop and give check. Would that be possible from the new position on the board? Indeed, queen moves to e5, check. Then forks king and bishop and wins a piece. Ideally you want to see this in one visual motion. Imagine checking the king with your queen from h8, and see the king move to g5 in your mind's eye, then see it aligned with the bishop, enabling you to play queen moves to e5, check. White to move. What is the best move? It all starts with seeing a loose piece. Here black has left his rook loose, so it's a target and the focus of operations. White can attack it with his queen but can't give check at the same time, and the check that is available to the queen moves to e8 won't change that. Yet the fork seems so close. Queen moves to d3 attacks the rook and would attack the king if only it were on h7. Look for checks by other white pieces that might push the king around, and you find just one. Rook moves to b8, check. Which forces the reply king moves to h7. Queen moves to d3, check. Follows, of course, winning the rook. White to move. What is the best move? Are any of black's pieces loose? Yes, the rook. White's queen can attack it from d4, and also from d7, but that's unsafe, but not while giving check, and the check's queen moves to c2, queen moves to d3, and queen moves to h6, all lose the queen. So look for ways to draw the black king into harm's way by checking it with another piece. White's rook has a check in rook takes bishop. If black replies king takes rook, then reconsider white's attack on the loose rook, still the target. Now queen moves to d4, check. Has become a working fork that wins back a rook and leaves white up a piece. White to move. What is the best move? Again black has left a rook loose. White's queen has no way to attack it and give check yet. Its two possible checks at a2 and d5 both are met by black with queen takes queen. But look for other checks on the board and see that the white rook has two, rook moves to d8 and rook takes at g7. Examine each of them. One rook moves to d8, check. Goes nowhere decisive after 1. Rook takes rook, 2. Queen takes rook, check. King moves to f7. But now ask what the board looks like after the other possibility 1. Rook takes at g7. Black replies king takes rook. With the king moved, re-examine the checks that would then be possible, see that queen moves to d7, check. Has been turned into a working fork that wins the rook. White to move. What is the best move? White is unhappy to see that black has hit him with a knight fork from e3. But since the fork doesn't include a check, White's response isn't tightly forced. He can think about taking the offensive rather than attempting damage control. So ask one by one, are any of black's pieces loose? Yes, the knight at e3 that is inflicting the fork. This is the target. White's queen can attack it, but not while giving check. The black king is hidden behind the bishop at g7. So look for other checks that might force the king into a vulnerable position, and find one. Bishop takes bishop, check. King takes bishop. Now queen moves to d4, check. Forks and wins the knight. Since white's move gives check, black never has time to carry out the knight fork he had been threatening. This problem illustrates the importance of not panicking when threatened with a knight fork. It also is a reminder of why knight forks against two non-kings often are so much less effective than knight forks that give check. Here white doesn't have to move his king, and so has time to mount a fresh threat of his own. White to move. What is the best move? Look for loose black pieces and you find both the bishop at b4 and the bishop at g4. White's queen has no checks that can be paired with attacks on either bishop, so he looks to his other pieces to help. The goal is a check that will draw the king out where it can be attacked at the same time as one of the bishops. The natural check to try first is one using white's bishop, since that also vacates c4 and makes it available for the queen. Hence 1. Bishop takes at f7, check. And then if black replies king takes bishop, white has 2. Queen moves to c4, check. This attacks the king and both black bishops, winning one of them and gaining a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? This position is almost the same as the previous one but with an additional exchange required at the beginning. 1 rook takes at f7, rook takes rook, 2 bishop takes rook, check. King takes bishop, and now queen moves to c4, check. Study this example to see how the same basic thought process still leads to the solution. The loose black bishops are the targets. If white's queen can move to c4 and give check, it will win a piece. Bishop takes at f7 is ineffective here because of the rook on f8, so you keep looking for more artillery you can bring to bear and find that the exchange rook takes at f7, rook takes rook makes possible the bishop check and sacrifice that in turn leads to the queen fork. White to move. What is the best move? Are any of black's pieces loose? Yes, the rook at a8, so that's our target. White's queen has two ways to attack it, queen moves to e4 and queen moves to f3. Neither move yet inflicts a check, but perhaps the black king can be drawn into position to be forked on f7 or h7 with an initial check or capture by another of white's pieces. White plays rook takes at f7. If black replies king takes rook, then queen moves to f3, check. Wins the a8 rook. This is a good example of using a capture rather than a check to attract the king onto a square where it can be attacked. White forces the king to move by taking something that only it protects. White to move. What is the best move? Black has a loose bishop at c6. White's queen has one safe, plausible way to attack it, queen moves to c2. If the black king could be drawn onto g6, a fork of king and bishop would be possible. White's bishop can help by taking the pawn at g6, giving check and taking a piece that only black's king protects. If black replies king takes bishop, the board is now arranged for a queen fork with queen moves to c2, check. Gaining white a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? Clearing the path to the forking square. Now we move to a slightly higher level of difficulty. These are positions where there is a square from which your queen might attack the enemy king and a loose piece, but where another piece or two blocks the way, blocking the queen's path to the forking square, or its path from the forking square to one of the targets. Once you see such a situation, the methods for resolving it are straightforward enough, but often it can be hard to see in the first place. Our first pattern consists of cases where the queen's path to the forking square is blocked. You discover this situation by looking for the ingredients for a double attack and finding a square from which it can be made. Then you consider whether the queen's path to the square can be cleared with a threat or exchange. In the position to the left, start by looking for the raw elements of a fork. Why, look, with queen moves to a8, white can fork black's king and his a7 pawn. How splendid! Yet perhaps we can do better. First, does black have any loose pieces? Yes, the rook at d7. Ideally you want to check his king and attack the rook at the same time. Are there squares from which the queen could do that? Sure, e6 or e8, in principle d5 and f7 would work, too, but the rook protects those so they aren't worth worrying about, and then there's c8, which is inaccessible. So if the black bishop on e5 were out of the way, white would have a good double attack. Can the bishop be captured by something other than the queen? No, And anyway, after any capture, black would recapture with its pawn, now on f6, and the white queen's path still would be blocked. You want the e-file cleared, so instead try threatening the bishop with a pawn that it will have to flee. White thus plays pawn from f3 moves to f4. If black moves the bishop out of the way to d6, queen moves to e8, check. Wins the rook. In the alternative, of course, black might choose just to forfeit the bishop. His best reply to pawn from f3 moves to f4 is queen moves to h5, allowing him to reply to pawn from f4 takes bishop with pawn from f6 takes at e5. The hard part here is seeing the potential for a fork in the first place, since at the outset your queen has no promising checks. The trick is to go with the clues that are available, see the loose piece, and realize there is a square from which you could give check, i.e., a forking square on e8. White to move. What is the best move? Again, start by looking for the ingredients of a double attack. Black has a loose rook at a8, a good target if you can take advantage of it. So ask whether you can check his king and attack the rook at the same time. Well, you can't, but are there any squares from which it could be done, whether or not they now are within reach? Yes, in principle c6 would work, though at present it's protected and the queen's path to it is blocked. Look to see what stands in the way, ask what methods you have for clearing the queen's path through and especially what exchanges. The natural answer is 1. Rook takes knight, pawn from d7 takes rook, 2. Queen takes at c6, check. Recapturing the rook and winning a piece and a pawn. Notice how the single blow, rook takes knight, takes care of both of white's problems at once, getting his own rook out of the way and forcing black to replace the protected occupant of c6 with a loose pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? The drill repeats. Start by looking for the ingredients of a double attack and work backwards. Does white have any loose pieces? Yes, a bishop at b5 and knight at e5. The question is whether black can check white's king and attack one of those targets at the same time. The path from a5 to the king is clear, and from a5 the queen also could attack the bishop or knight. This is a classic pattern in the opening, we studied it earlier in the chapter. So you've found a forking square, and now the question is how to get the queen to a5. Black's own pawn is in the way at c7. Try to clear it in a threatening manner that will require a response from white and give him no time to defend against the coming fork. The simple move pawn from c7 moves to c6 attacks the bishop, forcing it to move. Wherever it goes, queen moves to a5, check. Then wins the loose knight. Black to move. What is the best move? Strictly speaking, white doesn't have any pieces that are loose, but his bishop at h6 is attacked once and protected only once, and by another white piece, the queen, rather than a pawn. In a sense that makes the bishop as good as a loose piece. If black can attack the bishop and give check, the bishop will be lost, it will be attacked twice and protected just once, so bishop takes bishop will result. White wouldn't be able to recapture with queen takes bishop, because then black would play queen takes queen. But all this assumes black can get his queen onto a square where it can give check and attack the bishop at the same time, viz. h4. Black's own knight at f6 stands in the way. The trick is to vacate the knight from the square in a way that forces a time-consuming response from white, so look for captures the knight can make. 1. Knight takes at e4 attacks white's queen and can't be ignored. White responds with 2. Pawn from f3 takes knight or 2. Knight takes knight, knight takes knight, 3. Pawn from f3 takes knight. Either way, queen moves to h4, check. Then wins the bishop and black nets a pawn with the sequence. Black to move. What is the best move? The analysis here sounds almost the same as in the previous frame. Start by looking for the ingredients of a double attack and work backwards. If you ask whether white has any loose pieces, the answer again is not quite, but the b2 rook is attacked once and protected once, and by another white piece, the queen, rather than a pawn. This means the rook is underdefended. If black can attack the rook and give check, the rook will be lost. But all this presupposes that black can get his queen onto a square where it can check white's king and attack the b2 rook at the same time, i.e., d4. Only black's own knight already on d4 stands in the way. The trick is to vacate the square in a threatening way that requires a time-consuming response from white, so you look for captures and threats the knight can make. Knight takes at f3, check. Forks white's king and rook and requires the reply pawn from g2 takes knight. Queen moves to d4, check. Then wins the rook at b2 as described above. A general point to take away from this position and the previous one is that when you examine your opponent's pieces, you want to note not just whether they're protected but how they're protected and whether they also are under attack from other directions already. It's worth studying these two cases until it's clear that the targets, the rook on b2 here, and the bishop on h6 in the previous position, are vulnerable to forks in the same general way that loose enemy pieces would be. Black to move. What is the best move? First, does white have any loose pieces? Yes, the bishop at d3, and also the rook at a1, but it's inaccessible for now. You would like to check white's king and attack the bishop at the same time, so look for a square from which the queen might do it. You see that e3 fits the bill, and that the queen could reach it directly if black's own pawn at e5 weren't in the way. So ask whether the e5 pawn can vacate its square in a hostile manner that requires a time-consuming reply. Yes. 1. Pawn from e5 takes at d4, 2. Pawn from file e takes at d4, or pawn from file c takes at d4, queen moves to e3, check. Wins the bishop. You likewise might have seen this by imagining the consequences of pawn trades available to you in the center. You see that the first round of captures just described leaves the queen with a clear path to a new check and fork at e3. The likely payoff from seeing all this, of course, is the gain of just a pawn, for if your opponent sees the fork coming, and you should assume he will not recapture after pawn from file e takes at d4. By the way, it also might have occurred to you to start with pawn from e5 takes at f4, instead of taking d4, this likewise moves black's pawn out of the way. What's wrong with it? The trouble is that this time white can reply knight takes at f4, and then his knight suddenly protects the bishop on d3 that you had counted on as a target. It's no longer loose. White to move. What is the best move? White is behind in material and needs to make something happen. Let's approach this one with forcing moves. Step 1, experiment with checks, including a brazen gesture such as rook moves to d7, which invites black to play bishop takes rook. Step 2, consider the board as it would look afterwards, ask what lines would have been opened or closed as a result and what new checks you might then have. Here black's bishop would have evacuated the 6th rank, permitting white to play the check, and fork, queen moves to f6, check. Taking protection from the pawn on e5. The fork doesn't quite work because black's rooks are connected and guard one another. So persist and ask what move black would make in reply to queen moves to f6, check. His king would be forced to e8. Then queen takes at h8, check. Works for white after all. It's made safe because the connection between black's rooks has been broken by his king. More importantly, it's a skewer that wins black's other rook. Black has to move his king back to the 7th rank, and now white has queen takes rook a8 and a 1 game. Notice how goading black's bishop onto d7 removed d7 as a flight square for black's king and thus forced black to respond to 2. Queen moves to f6 with king moves to e8. So you have a winning idea if black responds to 1. Rook moves to d7 with bishop takes rook. But what if he doesn't? Consider whether he has anything better. His only alternative would be to move his king to f8 or e8. Think about what your next check would look like either way. If he plays king moves to f8, you have queen takes rook a8 mate. If he instead tries king moves to e8, 2. Queen takes rook a8 plus no longer works because black has king takes rook. That's okay, though, instead you play 2. Queen takes bishop e6 plus, forcing king moves to f8, then 3. Queen moves to f7, checkmate. So black is required to play 1. Bishop takes rook in the first place to avoid mate. These trains of thought are worth reinforcing until they are clear. Stepping back and looking at the original position, observe the open diagonals leading to black's rooks. See how they invite the idea of a queen fork, especially with the king on a center file and especially with a friendly pawn in the center poised to protect your queen. The basic forking possibility, queen moves to f6, is a little elusive at first because the rook on h8 doesn't become loose, and thus doesn't become a good target, until later. You might think like this: if I could get my queen onto f6, it would fork black's king and rook, and the rook would become loose if the king were forced by the check to step back onto the 8th rank. So if only I could get my queen over to f6 black. The other lesson to take away is the value of considering bold moves like rook moves to d7, check. The move looks counterintuitive because it loses a rook on the spot and you already are behind in material. But this won't stop you from experimenting with the move so long as you remember that the frequent purpose of such checks is just to force changes on the board that make forks or other tactics possible. That probably is the easiest way to see the solution here, not by spotting the forking idea from the outset, but by experimenting with checks you can give and then with new checks that become possible after your opponent's replies. This leads you to rook moves to d7 as a first move and then queen moves to f6, at which point the fork comes into view. White to move. What is the best move? Clearing paths to the targets. Now consider another variation on our theme. A potential fork is frustrated by a piece lying between the forking square and one of the targets, the king or the loose piece. Again, much of our attention will be devoted to the process of noticing such situations. Once they are found, standard tools, threats and exchanges often can be used to resolve them. The most important general skill here is the ability to see jump checks, moves that would give check if some piece, perhaps an enemy piece, or perhaps one of your own, weren't in the way. These are important to see generally, and they are especially important if you have found a loose enemy piece. For then you turn all your efforts to looking for a way to attack the loose piece and give check at the same time, and you don't want to overlook a check just because there is a piece that would need to be gotten out of the way before it can work. The best way to find checks like this is to try just aiming pieces at the enemy king. If pieces of your own are in the way, look for time-consuming threats you can make by moving them. If your opponent's pieces are in the way, try to force them off their squares with threats or by taking pieces they protect. In this first example to the left, look first for any loose enemy pieces. Here black's rook is loose at d7. Can white's queen attack it and give check at the same time? No, not yet. But if the queen moved to g4, it would be aimed at both king and rook, thus only the black pawn at g7 prevents a successful fork. So ask whether white can draw that pawn out of the way by taking something it protects. The g7 pawn guards the bishop at f6, which white can take with his rook. So 1. Rook takes bishop, pawn from g7 takes rook. 2. Queen moves to g4, check. Gets the black rook and wins a piece. Black to move. What is the best move? Almost the same. This time it is black's turn to move, so first look for any loose white pieces and find the rook at a2. Now ask whether black's queen can attack it and give check at the same time. No, not yet, but if the queen moved to d5 it would be aimed at both king and rook. Only the white pawn at g2 prevents this from being a successful fork. So ask whether that pawn can be drawn out of the way by capturing something it protects. It protects the knight at h3, which black can take with his rook. So 1. Rook takes knight. 2. Pawn from g2 takes rook, queen moves to d5, check. Wins a piece. White to move. What is the best move? Are any black pieces loose? Yes, the knight at d7. Can white's queen attack it and deliver check at the same time? No, but queen moves to g4 would aim the queen at both a loose piece and the king. It would be a winning fork but for the pawn at g7. White's goal therefore is to draw that pawn out of the way. Ask whether the pawn is protecting anything that white can attack, and you are led to 1. Bishop takes at h6, now if 1. Black pawn from g7 takes bishop, then 2. Queen moves to g4, check. Takes the knight, gaining a pawn and wrecking the black king's pawn cover. These first 3 examples all are basically the same, of course, they involve creating holes in the king's pawn cover so that the queen can check the king and attack a loose piece elsewhere at the same time. Black to move. What is the best move? A search for checks for black turns up queen moves to b1, a search for loose white pieces turns up the bishop on b7. Queen moves to b1, check. Would indeed be a winning queen fork if the pawn on b3 weren't in the way. So now the position becomes easy, to move a pawn, take something it protects. Black plays rook takes knight, white replies pawn from b3 takes rook, and black then has queen moves to b1, check. Taking the bishop next move and netting two pieces for a rook. Anytime you have long open lines available to your queen, inspect them carefully for opportunities like this. Black to move. What is the best move? It might look for all the world like black has nothing here, the lines to white's king appear cluttered and inaccessible. The trick is to notice that white's rook on a1 is loose, and then that black's queen is one move from being able to attack it with queen moves to g7. The open long diagonal should be conspicuous. The question is whether the attack on the rook can be paired with a check to create a fork. A line from g7 to white's king would need to be opened, so study the obstacles on that line, the little cluster of white bishop and black pawn, with a white pawn on f5. This cries out for a pawn capture that clears both blockages out of the way. Pawn from g6 takes at f5, and now white has to either move the bishop or lose it. If he moves it, black has queen moves to g7, check. Winning the rook. At first the g-file in this position looks hard to exploit constructively because of the two men that lie on it. Black's pawn capture is a very useful maneuver, worth a good look, as it creates an unexpected open line in a hurry. Notice that this position is structurally similar to the previous one. In each, you start by seeing that your queen is one move from being able to attack either the enemy king or a loose enemy piece, half a fork, and you see that the queen also would be aimed at the other half of the fork, whichever of those two pieces, the king or the loose piece, it wouldn't be attacking directly. The hindrance in both positions was that one of the lines the queen needed was blocked. The challenge both times was to get rid of the blockader. The solution in each case was to start with the capture of something the blockader guards, forcing it to evacuate the needed line and leave it open.